Pete, Tesla has over 5 million vehicles fitted with FSD hardware, commonly known as full self-driving, on the road today, driving an estimated 50 billion miles per year, 100,000 miles per minute. This ongoing data collection giving Tesla a major competitive advantage. With their end-to-end neural networks, can anybody catch up?
Is it an advantage, Grayson? Where's the product that has made it an advantage so far? When's it coming?
That's the question that we'd all like to know in the autonomy industry. You talk to engineers, that data set's going to be valuable. At some point, it could become an asset class.
No question. I think the potential and promise is very apparent, right? Nobody has it, like you said. That's a huge amount. On the other hand, like everything else in the self-driving realm, there's a lot of potential and promise for a lot of things. And in this case, the advantage for Tesla is something I've heard about for years, and we've all heard about for years. And I'm kind of waiting for the day where they do something with it.
Is FSD 12 that day, or perhaps getting closer to that day?
I mean, I think yes, it's not I don't think it's an inflection point necessarily, but I think FSD is probably getting better in a lot of ways. And in terms of going from one point to the next, it's an improvement. But in terms of it being a magic moment where this is suddenly working far better than it has been over since its release, I don't necessarily know that this is that moment, but I guess there's the potential that suddenly you hit that inflection point, and there's the hockey stick improvements in safety and functionality. But I think we still are short of that moment.
We're short of that moment. We're getting closer. Tesla's had their hiccups, but from an economic standpoint, they can scale FSD without the hardware that Waymo's getting. When Tesla hits their, let's call their Waymo point, where they're able to operate at a level of Waymo, what happens to the market?
When they get to that point, Grayson, I think it is a dramatic advantage, right? And we see that priced into Tesla's stock price now. But I don't know when that comes. And is that 6 months from now? Is that 2035? I wish I had some sort of insight. And that's been back to the idea that this is the industry's problem we've seen for so long is, how long does it take to solve the long tail problems? And I think, frankly, FSD is starting from a, lower points in competence than some of the other level 4 systems that we see out there in the robotaxi realm right now, for one example. The potential's great. Look forward to seeing the day when it becomes dramatically better and something that will really be in widespread use on public roads and improving safety. I think there's a lot of gray area as to how that's going to be measured by third parties who are verifying and validating some of the safety claims. But, I think we're years from that point.
There's a lot to be done. The question is, does Tesla have to add a radar? We have Wave out of the UK. They're doing a similar approach, end-to-end neural net. The big difference being they use a radar in addition to the camera. Is Tesla, do you think, going to need a radar to get over the hump?
Yes, no question. Maybe some LiDAR too.
LiDAR too. Interesting. The Luminar folks will like you for that statement.
Well, I just think you gain so many advantages from sensor redundancy, and LiDAR might be expensive, but clearly when you look at some of the crashes that Tesla has had into stationary fire trucks on highways, for example, or things like that, boy, every time I think if they had LiDAR, that would have been something that was easily avoided. And that one of the things that concerns me is why do they have the same or similar crashes over and over again? And I think this is a case in point right here. If you add LiDAR, there's a whole crash type that you could probably be eliminating.
Could be. How do you test it? Do we do the Luminar CES test? How do we test it?
Well, how about put some stationary fire trucks on the highway and see what happens? I think in a way, and I realize there's a lot of things that are hard to test for. You can't test for every edge case, but a big stopped truck on the highway or whatever your operating area is, that should not be an edge case. That shouldn't be hard. We shouldn't be having that same crash over and over again. And it's amazing to me that there's not been more focus on that. And I think it's probably going to take a emergency responder being killed before there's an outcry. But that, statistically speaking, I feel like that day is coming.
We hope that day doesn't come. From a technical perspective, could it be depth sensing? Could that be the issue? The cameras have to have better depth sensing technology. Sony has world-class depth sensing technology. Perhaps trying to integrate something of that along in there?
I think that's an interesting thought, and we've seen some stabs at that over the years, and maybe that technology is more mature than I know of right now, but why not add a radar? Why not add a LiDAR? It's or why not add, if there's better depth sensing technology available, why not add that? However you want to skin the cat, go ahead and do it. But camera only, as we know it today, has its limitations.
It does. Where does Mobileye fit into this whole equation? They have 16 million 1-minute driving clips. They're trying to develop it. Where do they fit in?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, it's interesting, and I know this is not what you're asking me, but to go back to the very first fatal Tesla crash involving autopilot, when that was the divorce point with Tesla, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes.
So where does Mobileye fit into this? Mobileye is really interesting, and they are growing their business. They've got an evolutionary path to automation that ends in full autonomy. In a way, I'd say that they are doing this at the pace that Tesla should be looking at, rather than kind of waiting for this big inflection point where everything ostensibly changes. But I think there's not one way to do this right. But I think the way that you look at Mobileye, both from a business and technology perspective, rolling out supervision, then comes chauffeur, then comes full autonomy. They've got their self-driving business that they're working with partners on. That all makes more sense to me than kind of the dog and pony show of a full self-driving, right?
It might be a dog and pony show, but up to this year, it was driving the stock higher. The business and revenue was growing. Or Mobileye, the business is not doing well. It's not doing well. Wall Street's expecting a quarterly loss of 7 cents per share, down 150% year over year, with revenues expected to be 226.35 million, down 50.6% year over year from a quarter ago. It's not a healthy business. That's a business in decline.
No question, Mobileye had the big shakeup earlier this year, right? Where there's all the excess inventory with relation to the IQ technology and chips. I definitely think that was a worrying moment for sure. But on the other hand, Mobileye said earlier this week that they sold 3.4 million units in the first quarter of this year. And Anand Shashua expects that to approximately double in the second quarter. So the question is that a blip on the radar screen, no pun intended there, or is there more fundamental problems with Mobileye's business? And I'll tell you, Grayson, I think the hope for Mobileye right now is I think they're transitioning away from the heavy competition across the board in the IQ chip space to looking at these greater levels of autonomy that they enable with not just the IQ chips, but the sensors they're developing and their overall software system, because they are talking about going from roughly $50 of revenue per unit to $1,500 with supervision, to $3,000 per car with chauffeur. So I think that the path Mobileye sees forward is ramping up production of those systems, finding buyers for those systems, particularly in China, because that's where the epicenter of the market right now, for a lot of reasons we can get into. But I think that's the promising path forward that Mobileye sees right now.
Be very blunt. I'll be very blunt. Frankly, I'll be rude, but I'll be a realist. If you're betting the future of your company on China with the geopolitical incidents going on right now, the United States Congress about to ban TikTok, and you don't think President Xi of China is going to retaliate, you need to be thrown out of the CEO's office, point blank.
How will that impact an Israeli company, not a U.S. company?
An American ally. I believe the United States government will ban TikTok here. We had the vote, unanimous vote. China is not going to stop at the U.S. shores. They are going to go to U.S. allies. You watch. This is not going to be pretty. This is not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty.
That's an interesting thought, and I guess I won't say you're wrong, but the geopolitical ramifications, as important as they are, probably extend beyond my specific area. But I think, could Mobileye be caught up and washed out because of that? That's an interesting scenario that you lay out. And I guess I wouldn't bet against that necessarily, but I think that from a business strategy point, they've got the right idea, if not the right geopolitical target in China. That's the number one auto market in the world. I don't know how you could make plans and avoid that right now.
Can't avoid it, but then you have the homegrown of Pony AI, you have the rise of BYD, which autopilot on navigation. They're developing their own. You can't follow it under, you can't make that up. That's one for you, Mr. Dell. Can't make that up. But you have the data collection issues. TikTok is gathering data, sending it back to China. Mobileye is gathering data. I'm not saying send it back to China. I want to be very clear on that, but they're gathering data and they're sending it back to their servers in Israel to develop their system. But yet the public doesn't know that a vehicle that they buy with a Mobileye chip is gathering data, and that the consumer driving around is being profited from. That becomes public. Then you have another issue with Mobileye. When you buy a Tesla, everybody knows Tesla gathers data. It's well known. I bet you less than 1% of individuals that are driving a vehicle with a Mobileye chip actually know that it's a Mobileye chip and that it's gathering data. At some point, you're going to get a congressman or a senator that's going to try and force Mobileye to pay a dividend to these individuals for using that or turn it off. And if that happens from a legislative standpoint, that data spigot gets turned off. What's the business?
Would that be the same for Tesla theoretically?
Theoretically, but the public knows.
I don't think Mobileye's hiding it right now. They adhere to GDPR in Europe, and I think that they're not doing anything nefarious or untoward. I think what they're doing is out in the open, but I think what you're highlighting is that way more people are paying attention to Tesla than they are any other auto supplier, any other automaker that's gathering similar data right now, or maybe it's not similar for mapping purposes, but go back to the Jim Farley comment a few years ago, probably many years ago at this point, where he told the crowd, we know how loud you're turning up the volume on your radio. Automakers know a lot about what we do in our vehicles, and so do their suppliers. And it's funny, Grayson, I actually used to write a lot about this years ago when I was working at AOL and Car and Driver to some extent, like the privacy issues related to motorists and their vehicles or motorists and traffic. Wrote a lot about license plate readers. What I found was, even as I thought some of these issues were generally alarming, what I found was the general public did not push back. That a lot of this was click the terms of agreement on your screen, and that was that. And most people did not care to the extent that, like, as of right now, like you're saying someone's going to push back on this eventually. And I think, yeah, maybe, but that is an ongoing concern or risk any way you slice it. But to date, that protest has not come across the board related to anything in automotive.
It's coming for a simple reason: the economy. Credit card default rates going up, auto loan delinquencies, repossessions going up. Consumers are suffering under inflation. They're going to look for any which way to keep a roof over their head and food on their table, and that's a clear way to do it. You're driving for a living. Let's say I'm an Uber driver. Shout out to Harry Campbell and the rideshare guy. You're an Uber driver, you're putting on 10, 15, 20,000 miles a year on your vehicle, and you're gathering data. That could become a revenue stream for you. Think about that. You get the Uber drivers to start asking for this revenue. It starts to bubble, and then it'll probably bubble in California with some workers' rights issues. You're going to have a political issue at some point that's going to be gathered because of the state of the economy.
You think the state of the economy is what pushes privacy concern over the top to the point where people demand revenue for their motor vehicle data?
That combined with all the Chinese geopolitical issues now, yes. We've got a powder keg that's about to explode, and now is probably one of the only times in the last, I would say, 20 years where this can all come together and actually happen, because all the ingredients are there today, especially if we do have a hard landing and or if we do go into a recessionary environment.
That's an interesting case. I could see some of those things playing out. The Chinese concerns regarding privacy, that I see as a powder keg. The rest of it, I feel like, yeah, does that get dragged along as a tailwind? Maybe. That's an interesting thought. But I still think there's a lot of inertia out there with too many people not caring that all this data is collected.
It takes one advocacy group. Let's just call a spade a spade. Look what Ouster did with their Go Broke campaign. When they went after Hesai, hired a bunch of lobbyists, took their entire marketing budget and put it into lobbying to stop their biggest competitor, which is a foreign company. I'm not going to deny that. But took their entire marketing budget and dumped it into that task. Somebody can do that to protect a business interest. Or look at the Dawn Project. He's out there ranting and raving. He got in trouble with the NTSB by putting their logo on the Super Bowl, but he got the attention.
No question. That was a success for the Dawn Project, right? Even the shenanigans that followed with NTSB, which rightly was concerned about the use of its logo, but that only just propelled the story for the Dawn Project. Yeah, I don't know. Like, the Ouster comparison is an interesting one. I think that's more B2B than you're going to get a group of motorists to a catalyzing point where they're concerned about privacy. The aspect that you raised with Uber, now you're kind of talking more B2B. And that seeing someone try to protect their data and take that fight on, that sounds more feasible. But I think we're a long way from a flashpoint.
Or, I'll give you, this is fun, or I'm going to give you an or. You have all the lawsuits going around the country around real estate commissions. The Missouri Supreme Court ruled in favor of the seller against the real estate industry, National Association of Realtors. Does that spark one of let's call him a billboard lawyer or a drive-by lawyer? And interesting. There's an opportunity here to do something similar. There's all this precedence that's happening, well, not directly related, similar scenarios. The realtors with their buyers taken advantage of, because that's what the MLS said you have to do. Well, I had to use the Mobileye chip because that's the car I bought. There's a lot of similarities here, and you could get a jury that is very sympathetic because of the economic situation.
I'm thinking about that you could tie it up in court for 5+ years and we'll have this conversation again in 2030 and maybe they'll be near some sort of landmark moment. But I still think we're far away from that particular scenario playing out. Do you remember John Ellis, who wrote the book? I think it was called like the $0 car or something like that. It was an interesting read, and he kind of lays out the scenario of how much money motorists could be making from their connected data and the inertia. That was what, 5+ years ago, and I haven't seen any movements toward that yet. Of course, as a consumer or motorist, I'd love to be making $30 a month or whatever from my data, but obviously that's not happening yet. So I don't know. I think we're moving toward that. We're going by inches and not by leaps and bounds.
And that last one, remember they said nobody will ever pay for music, nobody will ever pay for a book. Well, that changed and look what happened. It could change because data collection is only going to accelerate. By 2030, Morgan Stanley's estimated that Tesla's going to be gathering 400 billion miles per year of data. 400 billion? That's a lot of data to train their neural net.
It definitely is. Maybe there's a similar fight that's beginning to take shape right now with AI. We see New York Times and others demanding that you not use their content to train AI, which is going to aggregate and reframe, can synthesize a lot of different news articles into one. Is that similar in some way here? If I say you can't use my personal data as a car owner to go to the back end of Ford or GM or whoever, and you can't use that to train your self-driving software, I click the terms of agreement, okay, when I get in the car and I go on. But it's interesting, if you don't click that, what if you go to the dealership to buy your car and you're not going to sign the paperwork that gives them a lot of access right off the bat and then click okay? I think you'd find a lot of systems in your car are not going to work the way you would want them to.
What if there was a car owner bill of rights? Could change things.
That definitely could. And in fact, I think Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts and Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut posited or offered up something akin to that a few years ago with regard to cybersecurity in particular. But I think some of the data coming off your vehicle got brought into. I think that could be great, but I don't know. To your point earlier, that's how many people know there's a Mobileye chip in their car. Like, how many people know that their data is being hoovered up? Not many. So I think you'd have to have a massive education campaign in some way to get to a point where you had enough of a critical mass of car buyers or prospective car buyers that we're going to stay out of the market essentially to force the hand of the automakers. And I think we're not close to that point, but you could have that. I like the idea. Maybe you should write a op-ed in Automotive News proposing that.
Okay, I'll take you up on an op-ed. I'm not proposing it. I'm worried from an investor standpoint, from an economic perspective of what it could do to companies. It could bankrupt companies that have to change their models and they're going to have to basically go down the tubes. And I'm not worried about Tesla per se, because I'm going to use a very inappropriate term. It's a cult-like atmosphere around Tesla. The individuals that have a Tesla, they love Tesla. Look at all the Tesla ownership clubs online. It's the early days. What Tesla reminds me of, if I use the term the fanboys, it reminds me of the early days of Apple when their largest two customers were schools, one, and two, professional media with photography for video editing. Very loyal, very, very loyal, love the product. They would buy it every single time. Very, very similar. Tesla has a similar, no matter what Elon does, Elon says, or how good or how bad the Tesla vehicle acts, they're still going to buy it. On the backside, though I'm not making a prediction, I think the Cybertruck's going to do better than anybody's expecting.
Interesting. I mean, no question. I fully agree with you that the brand loyalty that Elon has built is incredible, right? I don't know of another brand out there today that generates that sort of like fervor among its enthusiasts. There's tremendous value in that. Like, no matter how good or bad the cars are, like, that's almost irrelevant at this point, right? Like, for years, we've seen some of the kind of manufacturing leeway that the door doesn't quite fit right, or the trunk has a gap or whatever. Like, nobody cares. Or I shouldn't say nobody, but there's an incredible extension of forgiveness and patience from the Tesla enthusiasts. And that's great in a lot of ways. Like, that kind of moves us from the mechanical age to the software defined vehicle, probably more particular upgradable features that you want to buy in your Tesla via over-the-air updates. Nothing says that to me more than the fact, like, the things that all these people in Detroit care about are not what Tesla buyers care about.
They care about the brand. At the end of the day, they like the Tesla experience. They like the big screen. Where does the possibility of Tesla licensing FSD fit into this equation?
Possibility. Again, back to where we started in a way, there's a lot of promise and potential with the idea of licensing it. I think you get to the question of who's really the viable, look at who's out there as potential customers. There might be an automaker or two who would definitely jump on that, but I don't know. It's a good question. Like, does Ford say that they've been developing their level 2 plus or level 3 systems with Latitude since Argo went away? Do they say we're not going to so much work with maybe Mobileye, similar with supervision? They're not going to do that over the long, either of those options for a level 4 system over the long run, that they'll just license it from someone else, say a Tesla. Would you want to license it from Tesla, or do you want to license it from Waymo? We could start saying Tesla wouldn't be the only one theoretically with a level 4 offering that could be licensed.
Licensing is the future of autonomy. Wave could do it. Tesla could do it. Zoox could do it. Waymo could do it. Let's get some economic numbers of this. Our RBC is projecting that if Tesla were to license it and FSD rates were to pick up, it would generate $35 billion in FSD revenue and $18 billion in licensing revenue by 2035 for a total of $53 billion a year in revenue. That's real revenue. If you're Ruth Port over at Waymo and that remotely comes close in a public SEC filing, Waymo's going to become a giant licensing business. Is that where this is all going to go? Licensing?
It certainly has potential, as those numbers illustrate. Back to like, how well does FSD really work? Or take the Waymo system. Like, we know what the ODD that Waymo works in is. If you're going to license it, how much more territory do you have to cover? And the promise, that kind of goes back to all right, well, Tesla's got the advantage in all this data. It's like, okay, why haven't they been able to act on that yet? When is the inflection point? I think to license it really means you're going to dramatically need to open up the ODD.
Could Waymo do a slimmed down version of the Waymo driver and say home to highway, then when you get to dense urban environment, take over and drive very similar to what Ghost is trying to?
They could. To my knowledge, they don't have a team working on that right now, but that'd be an interesting model. How much would they have to change from what they have right now? Probably a lot, because if you're going to go back to involving a human driver in some way and making this just a highway thing that a human driver takes over, at first blush, I would say for a Waymo, that'd be a heavy lift, because they've designed everything they do around the idea that they don't remember, going back to the John Krafchick days when he said the guy fell asleep in the Porsche in the earliest days of testing at Google. And they were like, whoa, like, we need human drivers out of this equation. That's very different. So I think it'd be a heavy lift, but maybe, there's this interesting second wave of companies that have come up in the last 4 or 5 years that were not part of like the initial hype cycle, but founded in the aftermath. We have, maybe you included Gatik. I'm trying to think if they were founded in 16 or 17, but I'm thinking like you mentioned Ghosts, Wave, Blue Space AI. So I'm curious, is there a fundamental different approach to development that some of these companies take, where we learn 5 years from now that being a first mover had disadvantages rather than advantages, and that they've been able to find a slimmed down way to develop automated vehicle technology that costs hundreds of millions instead of tens of billions? I don't know that they will, but I think there's a possibility that we're going to talk again in 2030, and there's this second wave of companies that we're not talking about or spotlighting a whole lot today that quietly emerge.
Could Alex Kendall, co-founder of Wave, he talks about the advancements of the end-to-end neural nets, which were enabling Wave to scale pretty dramatically. He came on a podcast earlier and talked about when Bill Gates was in London, how they had to pick Bill Gates up and where he wanted to go. So, yeah, we never drove it before, and talked about the economic inefficiencies of pre-map routes and what the neural nets allowing them to do from the end-to-end learning. FSD 12 is doing that. Perhaps that's the big breakthrough that we're going to get to. And you mentioned the Krafchick comments around removing the driver and sleeping. How did Apple never figure that out? Where they said, oh, driver in the loop, no driver in the loop, driver in the loop, no driver in the loop. How did Apple miss it? Is Apple missing their Steve Jobs, the gentleman and the individual with the driving force to see the craziest things through and make it become a reality?
I don't know if they're missing Steve Jobs on that as much as if he would have picked one direction and said, this is what we're doing for 10 years or 5 to 10 years, and that's the direction and that's that. Maybe we're not having the conversation about their long meandering project that every 6 to 12 months, it feels like there was another major change in direction. How could anything get developed like that, especially for the safety critical auto industry? Like that's just spun in circles, to use a corny automotive analogy.
They spent $10 billion, and all we have is CarPlay. Investors seem to be shrugging it off, but then you have one set of investors saying, wait a second, Apple needs the next great growth product. It doesn't look like it's going to be the Vision Pro. We have data coming out, the returns. We have Google data. We have actual data from stores returns. We have data from suppliers that it's really not taking off the way Apple expected it. Does Apple somehow decide to get back into automotive and redo a slim down Project Titan at some point because the TAM is so large and they need that next great revenue growth driver?
Maybe. I mean, I could definitely see that. CarPlay in itself is a terrific product. I know it's not the one that you're thinking of right now, but maybe they start with that and build out. I'm very curious along similar lines. What does the Sony car really do once it gets to the market? And could Apple be the biggest competitor to Afeela in some way? I don't want to say they follow, but do they kind of like regroup and say like, all right, like all these detours we took the first time around, we still have something there. And now we have a firm direction that we want to go. And if they're a couple of years behind, that doesn't necessarily matter. I could see them saying that, and that would make some sense when you've got the 10 billion isn't exactly a rounding error that they've already spent, but they can afford to make that mistake and then regroup at some point. No question.
Look at the BlackBerry, iPhone followed it, Palm, iPhone followed. They historically have never been the early one out there first. So it fits historically where they're looking to go. Sony, they're integrating all their technology. That to me, what Apple was always going to do. I always had this idea with the Vision Pro be integrated to augment the screens. Always thought that that's where they were going to go. And if Sony pulls it off with the Afeela, with their partnership with Honda, does Apple try and play nice in the sandbox and on day one start over and say, okay, we're starting with an automotive partner. We're not going to go to a supplier. We're going to start with an automotive partner. You build the driving function. You build the autonomy function. Our clear job and only job is to control the design and the interior. Could that happen?
Yes. And in fact, that's how I would see it playing out. Like, why would you want to build your own car at scale? I think they want or really need a automotive partner for that. Is it Foxconn? Well, I'd probably go for more of a traditional automotive manufacturer. Is it Magna? Magna Steyr, as was rumored for so long as like a key contract manufacturer. That was always intriguing. That makes some sense. I think that could happen in some form over the years.
Or there was an analyst report I read the other day. Is it Rivian? And one more thing. Oh, wait. And one more thing. And now here's the third one. And one more thing. The Apple Rivian car. Is it Rivian? They canceled the plant in Georgia, spending $2.6 billion. Stock went up 15.1% on the news of the cancellation of cutting costs. Could it be Rivian?
I have heard that so many times, especially this week where we've seen Rivian kind of unveil its new vehicles, which look great, by the way. I don't know, Grayson. I don't necessarily see that one, but it could be. I could be totally wrong. Apple would bring that infusion of billions of dollars to get all that going very quickly. But I don't know. I don't necessarily know if it's Rivian.
I agree with that. I thought the report was honestly crazy. I just had to get your opinion on it. The more I research this, the more I think about it. All roads seemingly lead back to Germany and BMW for some reason. That seems to be that. Or could they go VW? Let's not forget back in the day, Tim Cook drove an A5 in the early days of his CEO tenureship. Perhaps it's something with Audi. I just think if Apple is going to reboot it, call it Titan 2.0, even though there's been many iterations of Titan, it is going to have to be with an OEM part. I don't see any way around it.
It's kind of funny to think about VW or Audi as the partner because obviously they've had their long meandering problems with software development in recent years. So if you put those two things together, maybe they more than make up for each other's decade-long weakness.
If you look at weakness now becoming strength, all signs on the chip side point to Qualcomm. In Q1 2024, Qualcomm reported automotive revenue of $598 million, up from $456 million in Q1 2023, an increase of $142 million year over year. Sales were driven by the Snapdragon digital chassis solution. Their year over year automotive revenue is growing faster than both NVIDIA and Mobileye. Is Qualcomm going to be the next great player in the development of autonomy? They are going into ADAS. They have a $30 billion backlog there.
Absolutely. Remember, they bought Veoneer a few years back, and that developed the Arriver software, or they bought part of Veoneer to be more accurate. And they've been developing the Arriver software for automation and autonomy. Yes, I think Qualcomm Qualcomm has become already the quiet giant of the automotive industry. They're not just doing the chips. They combine the cockpit and everything else that some of their competitors are doing. And I think when you look at the Snapdragon and digital chassis, like they have put together as much of an end-to-end offering as anyone out there. The auto industry has clearly been embracing that. What a success story. And it's interesting, you see in 2022, automotive represented about 6% of Qualcomm's revenue. And I forget what that jumped to last year off the top of my head, but you see it really increasing, and automotive is becoming more and more important to Qualcomm. And Qualcomm is even more so, probably Qualcomm has become essential to the auto industry right now.
They're a good partner, and they're based in San Diego. They're American partners. They're not going to get caught up in the geopolitical headwinds we talked about. On the geopolitical headwinds front, what are your thoughts on BYD opening the plant in Mexico? Because it's part of NAFTA, so you're not going to get the tariffs.
Well, I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, right, Grayson? Chinese automakers are already selling cars in Canada. They've clearly arrived in Europe in a major way. And to your point, BYD is setting up shop in Mexico. And I think it's a matter of time. And, we've talked about lots of things that potential or promising or down the road, but, within 2 or 3 years, I think that's the time frame where we're going to see BYD and other Chinese automakers really starting to come into the US market. It's a matter of time and not much time. So I think that's really probably a frightening prospect to the likes of Ford and General Motors, who have left the low end of the market like wide open for a competitor such as any Chinese automaker you want to name. But it's hard to go out and get a car that's $25,000 right now. I don't want to say it's impossible, but that's a very difficult proposition, and I think it's ripe to be exploited.
If I'm Detroit, I'm scared. There's no way around it. And you go back to the data collection standpoint, Congress is going to have a field day on that because those vehicles are going to be gathering data. It's going to get very, very interesting from a political standpoint where the Chinese vehicles go in there. And getting back to the data and the chips, so as I said earlier, Qualcomm's automotive revenue is surpassing, outgrowing Mobileye's and NVIDIA's. You look at NVIDIA's earnings, it's a data center company. Their automotive earnings, yes, while growing, they're not growing exponentially. Do they look to try and reboot that to get it to grow, or is this that the hype cycle from automotives finally meeting the reality as it relates to NVIDIA's GPU chips?
I'm gonna ask a different question here. Sorry, and I'll bounce back to your question. But I think the fundamental question is there room for Mobileye, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA to grow in the automotive space simultaneously, or is the size of the pie set? I think it's the former more so than the latter. I think Qualcomm, again, like because they have a offering across the board that is assisted driving software, that is cockpits, that is a little bit of everything, that they're growing faster. Automakers can kind of mix and match what they want out of that too. But I think that there's room for all three to grow.
I think there's room for all three to grow, but you're going to see Qualcomm, in my opinion, emerge as the leader. They have the driving technology. They have the infotainment, which you and I both know is going to play a very large role. And NVIDIA also have both. They have the MBUX, so they're doing the hyperscreen, which is a beautiful screen, by the way. But Qualcomm's business just seems like their management is more focused on growing automotive, or NVIDIA's management seems like they're more focused on growing the data centers. There's a Bloomberg report today that when the stock hits 1,000, NVIDIA is going to announce a stock split. They just want to keep the growth going on data centers, which, well, now when we're in this hype cycle, which I believe that we're in a bubble and these run-ups, the stock's up 50% to January 1st, doesn't make any sense. You have to start to diversify your business. That concerns me about NVIDIA because at some point that stock is going to start to correct and come down. And Mobileye, we laid out the data issues, the privacy concerns there. I'll put it back to you. Is this if Qualcomm plays their cards right, do they become the largest supplier to the market?
Yes. And they're playing a lot of cards right today. It's hard to say that I have any questions about Qualcomm's strategy right now. I think that they have not just played their cards right, but executed throughout the years. They had a very long-term game plan on how they were going to get more involved in automotive, and they haven't really wavered from that. And probably since the days, like the last time I can remember them wavering from an automotive strategy was, I think it was like 2012 when they were doing like electric vehicle infrastructure with chargers embedded in the ground. And they stopped doing that, but that's the last time I can think of them really backing away from something or making a big pivot on the automotive space. For a decade now, probably it's been, here's the plan, and they've executed on the plan.
They're doing a good job. The market is getting competitive. How do you see the autonomous driving market evolving over the next 5 years?
Boy, you take whatever sliver of that you want to start with. I think trucking is one thing, and that's probably the most prominent place that I see autonomous driving evolving, unless you're talking about a driver assist system and a passenger vehicle. And then robotaxi is something entirely different altogether. So all of those it's not one thing. It's how do all three of those evolve? And there's probably other offshoots of that I'm not articulating right now, too.
Well, let's start with trucking. What are your thoughts on the autonomous trucking market?
I think that unlike a lot of the other applications for automated driving, like there's a clear commercial use case for automated trucking that's going to lower the cost of goods at a time when groceries are really high, as a lot of us know. And I think if I'm a trucking operator, like once my competitor has that and they're moving goods 24/7, especially at night when there's less of a logjam on the highway, then I have to have that. That's essential. Otherwise, I'm going to go out of business. So I feel like with the idea that Kodiak Robotics and Aurora are going to go driverless later this year for long haul routes, with the idea that Gatik is already doing some driverless deliveries in Arkansas and I think Texas as well. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that they have started driverless there. That's where I would be expecting to see a proliferation of automated vehicles here in the next 3 years. What Waymo's doing on the robotaxi side is really interesting, but they're clearly an exception to a dwindling pool of competitors. They're expanding in California right now as we speak. They just got permission from the California Public Utilities Commission to really dramatically change the territory that they're operating in. They're now going to be throughout the peninsula, throughout Los Angeles. That's huge. But if they're the one out there, and I guess Amazon and Zoox are the big question mark right now, like what's going on there. But I think Waymo can afford, it has the luxury of not having a competitor right now, so they can go slow and steady. Make sure they just announced Austin the other day too. I feel like robotaxis with Waymo in particular are going to continue to gradually, steadily, but not exponentially ramp up here over the next 5 years.
Is there even a robotaxi market outside of China, or is it purely just Waymo?
Well, again, with the big question mark of what is Zoox up to these days, I think it's just Waymo right now. I guess we could say Cruise is a question mark too, but I think there's a lot of questions about their technology and at what pace they go forward. Like clearly they were trying to bite off more than they could chew before. And I think setting up operations in like 12 different cities was draining them financially. I think there's a finite amount that General Motors is going to spend on Cruise. Unlike a Google or Amazon, the deeper pockets do come into play there. And I think that Cruise could come back more focused in 1 or 2 Texas cities, and then we'll see what happens. But they have to be in it for the long game, and they have to be willing to play a slow game this time. Otherwise, they didn't learn the lessons that they needed to learn out of the San Francisco incident that got their driverless permit suspended.
I wish Cruise well. I wish him for a comeback. It's really interesting. Mary Barr did an interview last weekend in Barron's. Just typical PR interview. But the interesting line was Ms. Barr talked about personally on autonomous vehicles, and that's the future for GM. And then Mr. Paul Jacobson, CFO of GM, went to an investor conference and also reiterated the same statement. And Mrs. Barr's interview, she talked about, we got rid of all the operations, but we kept all the engineers. Is Mr. Jacobson and Ms. Barr indicating to the market that GM is going to use Cruise as an incubation platform to develop a GM personally owned autonomous vehicle? Do you think that was the breadcrumbs that they're leaving there?
I don't know. Like that statement caught my eye too, because on the flip side, you have GM with Super Cruise, where they just added 750,000 more miles, probably, if not on the same day that Mary and Paul were talking, pretty close to it. So I guess you get to a question of which one of these becomes the future personally owned vehicle developer for General Motors. And obviously one has a human backup and one does not. And as we talked about with Waymo before, and kind of going backwards and licensing theoretically for driver assist sort of systems, I think it's hard to develop something that has no role for a human driver gradually as you have a human driver. On the other hand, that's a business reality that I think we see for companies like Mobileye and on the trucking side Plus, where there is that evolutionary path. So I don't know, like in General Motors, I guess we'll have an option between the two. And maybe there's some melding of the two. But there you go. Like at least that's like an interesting long-term play for we're going to bring this into vehicles at some point when it's ready. Full self-driving, for example. GM not a candidate to license it, Grayson. I think that they have two reasonable options in-house that they can tinker with to some extent.
They have two reasonable options in-house, and from an investor standpoint, at some point, GM is going to have to figure out their autonomous vehicle strategy, whether it's a personally owned autonomous vehicle, whether it's a revamped group. They're going to have to really signal that to Wall Street, because GM now is clearly falling behind on their autonomy strategy. There's a lot to come, a lot to unpack. When we get some numbers from GM and Ford and other large OEMs as it relates to their autonomy plans, we're going to have you back on the road to autonomy economy to dive into those. And for Pete, for today, as we look to wrap up, what would you like our listeners and viewers to take away with them today?
Boy, I feel like last time, Grayson, I closed with the more we go forward, the less I feel like I know. So I have to come up with something new today. I think that the market is bifurcating. I think Waymo is pulled away on the robotaxi side of things. And well, I guess I'll say this, like, I'll stick to one thing. I think seeing Waymo operate at the Phoenix airport, seeing the scope of the territory that they are biting off in California, and we don't know how many vehicles they're going to run in that anytime soon. Like, I think that's an interesting question that remains. As sure as I see competitors fall away, like, I feel like I am more certain than I was maybe a year ago that there's a robotaxi future here.
There is a robotaxi future here. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is autonomous vehicles on every road in the world. Pete, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy economy today.
Thanks for having me, Grayson. Great to be here as always.